She didn't ask for permission. She didn't lower her voice. She walked into that award ceremony on his arm like she had already rewritten history, and she wanted every single person in that room to know it. Welcome to Crimson Secrets. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. We have viewers from all over the world, and I love seeing where you all are. Now let's get into this story, because I promise you, this one is something else. Priscilla Dunmore had spent 11 months believing she had won. That was the thing about her. She wanted wantment, she wanted the acknowledgement, she wanted the public confirmation, the social proof, the moment when everyone who had ever smiled politely at his wife would have to redirect that smile toward her. She wanted the ceremony, and on the night of the Alderton Foundation Gala, the single most important black tea event in Hartford's philanthropic calendar, she got exactly the stage she had been waiting for. She wore midnight blue. She had picked the color deliberately. Not red, which would have been too obvious. Not black, which would have made her disappear. Midnight blue said, "I am serious. I am here. I am permanent." And standing beside her, in a tuxedo that fit him the way expensive things always fit men, who have never had to think about money, was Thaddeus Wren. Thad, as everyone called him, 44 years old. President of Wren Capital Management, a firm that had grown over the past 2 decades into something that managed over $6 billion in assets. The kind of man who got invited to every table and seated at the one closest to the door that mattered. The kind of man whose name appeared in endowment reports and charitable program credits and the marble plaques on the sides of hospital wings. The kind of man who had been married for 17 years to Mathilde Osgood Wren. What Priscilla understood, or thought she understood, was that what Priscilla had not fully computed, because ambition has a way of narrowing the field of vision, was that Mathilde Osgood Wren was not simply Thad's wife. She was the only daughter of Reginald Osgood. And Reginald Osgood was the kind of man whose name did not to remain the person who decided which plaques got made. But that realization would come later. First, there was the entrance. The Alderton Gala was held every October in the Grand Hall of the Meridian Hotel, a building that was itself quietly, partially owned by a real estate trust, in which the Osgood family held a controlling interest. Though you wouldn't find that fact on any of the evening's printed programs. The hall had like frozen waterfalls, and tables set with linens so white they were almost aggressive about it. Every seat in the room represented someone who had given at least $100,000 to a cause that year, or who intended to, or who needed to be seen intending to. Priscilla had been to charity events before. She had attended them on Thad's arm for the past 11 months, gradually, the way you turn up the heat slowly enough that no one notices the temperature changing until the water is already boiling. She knew the room. She recognized the faces. She had learned, over those months, how to stand slightly ahead of him in photographs, how to speak about his work as though it were also hers, how to accept compliments about she had started saying their taste in wine. She had made herself at home in a life she hadn't been invited into, and tonight she stopped pretending she needed an invitation. There was a moment, just after they were seated at table 4, which was very good placement, close to the podium, close to the foundation's board, when a woman named Cecile, who sat on 3 of the same charitable committees as Mathilde, leaned over to the woman beside her and said something very quietly. Priscilla couldn't hear it, but she could read the way Cecile's eyes moved, from Priscilla's face to the empty chair beside her, to Thad, and back again, and she could read the way the second woman didn't respond with words, but instead reached for her water glass, in that very particular way that people do when they want to give their hand something to do. Priscilla noticed it. She filed it away. And then she lifted her chin slightly, smiled at the room, and decided it didn't matter. This was the thing about her that Thad had always found both attractive and recently, quietly, exhausting. Priscilla Dunmore did not doubt herself. She never had. She had grown up in a small city in Connecticut, the daughter of a pharmacist and an elementary school teacher, and she had understood, by the time she was 15, that the only way out was through. Through every room. Through every ceiling. Through every door that wasn't technically open to her. She had worked for it. She had a master's degree in finance, from a school that had not made it easy for her. She had built a career in wealth advisory that was genuinely, objectively impressive. She was not a fool, and she was not riding on someone else's momentum. She had momentum of her own. But she had made one calculation error, and it was a significant one. She had assumed that what Thad was leaving was a marriage. She had not understood that what he was actually doing, what they were actually doing, together, publicly, in this room, on this night, was something much closer to a declaration of war against a family that had been quietly winning wars since before or either of them was born. Thad had met Mathilde when they were both 26. He had been smart and ambitious and slightly desperate when they can see exactly what they want and aren't quite sure they deserve it. She had been calm. Not cold. That was a mistake people made about her, confusing stillness for absence. She was warm, actually, deeply so, but she expressed that warmth in a way that was more like a radiator than a fire. Consistent. Structural. The kind of warmth that kept the room livable long after the dramatic heat of a fireplace had burned out. She had loved him. That was the part of the story that nobody in this room wanted to sit with, because it complicated the narrative in ways that were uncomfortable. She had loved him without conditions or performance, and she had watched him grow into the man that Priscilla was now standing beside, and she had been, for 17 years, the quiet infrastructure of everything he had built. She had also, at the age of 23, received a trust from her father. A trust that, when combined with the Osgood family's broader financial holdings, including several of Wren Capital Management's largest institutional clients, meant that somewhere between 40 and 60% of everything Thad had built rested, architecturally, on a foundation that bore her family's name. Thad knew this. He had always known it. He had simply, over the past 2 years, allowed himself to believe that knowing something and being affected by it were different things, that he was successful enough now, independent enough, established enough, that the original scaffolding could come down and the building would stand on its own. That was the second significant calculation error of this particular story. Mathilde was not at the gala. This was the fact that Priscilla had noted with quiet satisfaction when they walked in. She had scanned the room the way she always did when they attended the events together, tracking the social weather. And Mathilde's absence had registered as a data point that confirmed what she already believed, that the contest was over. Mathilde had chosen not to come, which meant, in Priscilla, Mathilde had conceded, had stepped back, had accepted the new arrangement and chosen not to subject herself to the public evidence of it. What Priscilla did not know, because no one at table 4 knew, and because the people who did know were very deliberately not at table 4, was that Mathilde was not absent because she had surrendered. She was absent because she was already in the building, not in the grand hall, in the mezzanine-level meeting suite on the floor above, where her father and 3 members of the Osgood family office had been quietly seated since 7 o'clock, reviewing documents that had been prepared over the past 4 months by 2 of the most discreet attorneys in New England. Mathilde was sitting at the head of the table, not because she was in charge of the meeting. Her father had been running rooms like this longer than most of the people downstairs had been alive, but because she had asked to be there. She had asked to see it happen, not out of cruelty. Out of something that required presence to process. She was wearing a silk blouse the color of old ivory, and her hair was pinned back the way she wore it when she needed to be the version of herself that she looked like what she was. A woman who had made a decision and had arrived at the other side of the grief and was now in the part of the experience that was purely administrative. Her father, Reginald Osgood, sat to her left. He was 71 years old. He was not a tall man, had never been, but there was a quality to his physical presence that people consistently struggled to describe accurately afterward. They would say things like he commanded the room or there was something about him which were both true and inadequate. What was actually true was that Reginald Osgood had spent 50 years being the person in every room who had already seen the end of the conversation before it started, and that certainty had settled into his body the way calcium settles into bone. He didn't perform authority. He metabolized it. He hadn't said much during the drive over. He had held his daughter's hand in the back of the car for the first 4 minutes, and then let go, and she had understood that the gesture meant, "I am here. We don't need to discuss it further. Let's go." They had finished reviewing the documents by 8:15. At 8:42, the Foundation's executive director took the podium downstairs to introduce the evening's first honoree. At 8:44, 2 members of the Osgood family office took the elevator to the lobby. At 8:47, Mathilde and her father walked down the back staircase to the main floor of the Meridian Hotel. Priscilla was in the middle of a conversation with a man named Dexter, who managed municipal bonds for a firm in Boston, and who had spent the last 8 minutes talking about a sailing trip he'd taken in August when she became aware of a shift in the room. It was the kind of shift that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't begin with a sound. It begins with the people at the tables closest to the door, changing the angle of their attention by approximately 15 degrees, and that change propagating outward through the room the way a change in water pressure propagates through a pipe, invisibly but with physical consequence. Priscilla turned. Reginald Osgood entered the room the way he always entered rooms, without theater, without announcement, without any indication that he was aware of the effect he had. He was simply walking toward a destination. The crowd rearranged itself around him, not because it was told to, but because the geometry of the situation made it the obvious thing to do. Behind him, and slightly to his left, Mathilde walked with the posture of someone who had stopped performing composure, because she no longer needed to. She wasn't performing anything. She was simply there, present, in the specific unavoidable way that the people we have tried to make invisible are always most present at the exact moment we most need them not to be. She was wearing a dress the color of deep green, not dramatic, not designed to compete. But she was, and had always been, the kind of woman who could make a room understand something important without saying a word. The executive director at the podium did not stop speaking, but 3 people at the head table reached for their phones simultaneously. At table 4, a board member named Augustin, one of the Foundation's longest-serving trustees, and a man who had known Reginald Osgood for 35 years, stood up from his chair. Not dramatically. He simply stood, the way you stand when someone you respect enters a room, and you are the kind of person who still does that. 2 other people at the table followed with the slightly delayed timing of people who are following a social cue rather than generating one. Thad saw it. Priscilla watched his face. She was very good at reading his face. She had spent 11 months studying it, and what she saw in the 2 seconds, after he registered his father-in-law's presence, was something she had never seen there before. Not panic. Something quieter and more final than panic. The expression of a man who has just understood, with complete clarity, the distance between what he thought he was doing and what he had actually done. He had thought he was choosing a woman. He had thought he was choosing a woman. He had not understood that he was leaving, was not, had never been, simply the world that contained his wife. It was the world that contained everything. Priscilla didn't know this yet. She was still reading the room, still recalibrating, still trying to understand why Cecile had turned to look at her twice now, with that particular expression. Not hostile, which would have been easier to process, but something more like pity, which was worse. What Priscilla was beginning to understand in the slow and terrible way that understanding sometimes comes was that she had walked into this room believing she was the story. She had not known until approximately 8:47 on a Thursday evening in October that she was the occasion. The story belonged to Mathilde. It always had. Reginald did not go to table 4. He wasn't there for that. He went to the head table, where he sat down in the empty chair beside Augustin, who shook his hand with the slightly relieved quality of a man who had been expecting a storm and is grateful that the storm has taken a manageable form. They spoke quietly. They did not look toward table 4, near the side wall, not hidden, not central, but placed with the care of someone who understood sight lines. She greeted the people around her with the warmth that had always been her actual register, and she accepted a glass of water, and she sat with her hands in her lap and listened to the speaker at the podium with what appeared to be genuine attention. From across the room, there was nothing dramatic to observe. A woman attending a gala, a father greeting old friends, a room full of people eating a very good dinner. But at table 4, the temperature had changed. Thad's phone had been in his jacket pocket since they sat down. He'd been trying to be present, trying to perform the ease of a man who had nothing to be uneasy about. He reached for it now. The screen showed 2 missed calls from a number he recognized as belonging to his firm's general counsel. He excused himself from the table with a murmur about a work call. Priscilla watched him go. She turned back to the conversation, to Dexter and his sailing trip. And she laughed at something and reached for her champagne, and inside her chest, something that wasn't quite fear, but was closely related to it, had begun to make itself known. Thad stood in the corridor outside the grand hall and called the number back. The call lasted 6 minutes. When he returned to the table, his face had reorganized itself into something careful and neutral, the way faces do when they are covering a significant amount of internal activity. He sat down. He did not reach for his champagne. He looked at the table in front of him for approximately 3 seconds longer than was normal. Then he looked up, and his eyes found Reginald Osgood across the room. Reginald was not looking at him. He was listening to Augustin tell a story that had apparently reached its punchline, because he was smiling. A small, contained smile, the smile of a man who finds certain things genuinely funny, but doesn't need to perform that fact for an audience. Thad looked back at the table. On the other side of the room, a woman who served on 2 of the same boards as Mathilde had opened her phone under the table and was typing a message to a colleague that read simply, "You need to see what's happening at the Alderton tonight." She pressed send. She put her phone away. She reached for her wine. What had happened in the 6 minutes of that phone call was this. Wren Capital Management's 2 largest institutional clients, both of whose relationships with the firm traced back in their original form to introductions facilitated through the Osgood family network, had notified the firm's general counsel that they would be conducting a routine review of their advisory relationships in the first quarter of next year. A routine review. That was the language. The kind of language that was technically accurate and contained no threats. Additionally, and communicated everything. Additionally, the general counsel had mentioned very briefly, as a separate matter, almost as an aside, that the lease on the firm's Hartford office, which was held through a property management company, had been quietly placed on the market last month. A property management company in which the Osgood family office held a 43% stake. Again, no threats, no drama, no confrontation in the middle of a black-tie dinner. Just data. Just information. Just the slow architectural readjusted that had always, it turned out, been held up by load-bearing walls that belonged to someone else. This was how the Osgoods operated. Not with fire, not with scenes, with gravity. Priscilla did not know about the phone call. She would not know about the specifics until much later, weeks later, in a conversation that would happen in a very different context, in a much less elegant room. What she did know by the end of that evening was that the room had not responded to her the way she had expected it to respond. She had arrived believing that the public nature of the evening would constitute a kind of endorsement, that the people in this room, people who had known Thad for decades, and Mathilde's wedding, people who sat on the same boards and donated to the same causes, and summered in the same general geography, would update their understanding of the situation based on what they observed tonight. They did update it, just not in the direction she had anticipated. The updating was subtle. It was in the way Cecile's friend answered a question. Priscilla asked, with a response that was technically complete and felt slightly remote. It was in the way the conversation at table 4 redistributed itself over the course of the evening, leaning slightly away from where she sat, the way people lean subtly away from a draft without consciously deciding to. It was in the fact that 3 people who had greeted Thad warmly when they arrived did not seek him out again over the course of the next 2 hours, though they were in the same room. Nobody was rude. Nobody needed to be. Rudeness would have required investment. What Priscilla encountered instead was something more efficient, the quiet withdrawal of social energy from a situation that the room had collectively, without meeting or discussion, determined was not one it wanted to ratify. She had wanted to be seen as the future. The room, having seen what it had seen, had declined. The ceremony ended at 10:30. The formal dinner had concluded. The honorees had been applauded. The foundation's chairman had made his remarks, and the room had begun the slow dissolution of a long evening. Reginald stood from the head table, shook hands with 4 people, and made his way toward the exit with the unhurried precision of a lifetime, understanding that the most powerful exit is the one that requires no explanation. Mathilde rose a moment later. She said goodbye to the people at her table. Warmly, with the genuine interest in other people that had always been one of her most disarming qualities, and she paused once on her way toward the door. She was about 12 feet from table 4 when she stopped to greet someone she recognized, a woman whose daughter had been in the same class as the Wren's son at school. They spoke for a moment. They laughed about something. Mathilde touched the woman's arm in that way she had, and then she continued toward the door. She did not look at table 4. Not because she was avoiding it. She had long since moved through the phase of the experience that required avoidance, but because there was simply nothing there she needed to see. She had already seen it. She had arrived at this evening having made all the decisions that needed to be made, having felt all the things that needed to be felt, and she had come not to confront, but to complete. To close something in herself by being present, for the moment that ended it. She walked out of the grand her. At table 4, Thad was looking at his hands. Priscilla was looking at the door. And the room, which had understood long before either of them did, had already moved on. It is worth saying here, because it is the part of the story that most people miss when they first hear it. Mathilde Wren did not plan any of this to be a performance. She did not orchestrate the evening for spectacle. She had not arranged for her father to attend in order to send a message, or to humiliate Thad in front of his professional community, or to make Priscilla feel what she felt standing in that room. Reginald Osgood had attended the Alderton Foundation Gala every year as, for over 3 decades, he had been a founding donor. His name was in the program, as it was every year, in the list of Legacy Circle contributors. He had not come because his daughter was going through a divorce. He had come because October meant the Alderton Gala, and the Alderton Gala meant Reginald Osgood. The reviews of the client relationships, the questions about the lease, those were also not punitive. They were appropriate. When the professional and personal circumstances that had formed the context of a long business relationship change materially, it is reasonable, it is responsible, to review the relationship. That was all. It simply turned out that the aggregate effect of all of these entirely reasonable, entirely non-dramatic actions occurring in proximity and in view of a room full of people who understood exactly what they were looking at was something that felt, to the people experiencing it, very much like a verdict, in the way that facts, when they come together, always constitute a verdict. Not because anyone pronounced it, but because the physics of the situation left no other interpretation. Thad had thought he was leaving a wife. He had not understood that he was leaving a world, and that the world, it turned out, was not prepared to leave him in return. Priscilla drove herself home that night. She sat in her car in the parking garage for 7 minutes before she started the engine, looking at the concrete wall in front of her. She was not stupid. She had never been stupid, and in the particular silence of that parking garage, with the sound of other cars leaving, and the distant echo of the hotel elevator, and the overhead fluorescents doing what fluorescents do, she began to do what she had always done when a situation had not unfolded the way she had anticipated. She recalculated. She went back through the evening, the way you go back through a document, looking for the moment the logic broke. The way Cecile had looked at her, the way the conversation at the table had leaned, the way Thad's face had changed when he came back from the phone call, the way Mathilde had paused 12 feet from their table, and spoke into that woman, and laughed, and touched her arm, and continued toward the door without a single glance in their direction. Not because she was pretending they weren't there, because they weren't what she was there for. Priscilla sat with that for a long time, longer than she would ever admit to anyone, in that fluorescent-lit parking garage in Hartford, Connecticut, on a Thursday night in October. Then she started the engine. The settlement was finalized 7 months later. The terms were not made public, though people in certain circles were able to arrive at reasonable approximations through the usual methods of inference and proximity to information. See, what was made public, or at least made known, was that Wren Capital Management had, in the following year, lost 2 of its largest institutional clients, seen its Hartford office relocate to a significantly smaller space across town, and watched its managing partner step back from several of the board positions he had held, citing a desire to focus on core business operations. Thad still had money. He would be fine in the way that men like Thad are generally fine, because the world is constructed in ways that ensure a certain baseline of fineness for men like Thad. But the shape of things had changed. The scale had contracted. The table he was seated at the following year's Alderton Gala, was not table 4. Priscilla was not at the following year's Gala. She had left Hartford for a position in Boston, which was a good decision for many reasons, including the obvious one. Mathilde was there. She was at table 2. Not because anyone had arranged it, but because that was where the board members sat, and she had joined the Alderton Foundation's Board of Trustees the previous spring. She wore a dress the color of old champagne. She laughed more than she had in a long time. She did not perform being fine. She simply was. And near the end of the evening, when Reginald came to find her, she stood up and took his arm the way she always had, and they walked out of the room together, and the room, which had always understood this too, that there are people who mistake proximity for power, and position for permanence, and a season for a dynasty. And there are people who simply know what they are made of. And in the end, the room always knows the difference.